Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining the third session in the AIA in California's Fire Response Series, Landscape and Defensible Space, Designing for Fire Safety. As you get settled, please feel free to say hello and where you're joining from in the chat today. To qualify for continuing education credit, AIA California provides the learning objectives for every webinar and includes them in the presentation that can be made available online. A few housekeeping reminders. Today's session is being recorded and qualifies for 1.5 AIA HSW learning units. For those who stay on and watch live, AIA California staff will report these units for you and will send follow-up information on how you can request a certificate of completion. We plan to have opportunities today to take questions from attendees towards the end of the session. Please be constructive in your comments and questions to help foster a positive learning experience for everyone. I just wanted to say we are so grateful for having a long list of fantastic speakers and moderators here today for the session. Thank you all so much for being here. I'll be dropping a link in the chat where you can find additional information on each of our speakers. And I'll hand it over to our first, Clark Stevens. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. A lot of people today. Let me get things started here. I'm going to be providing a bit of an overview. I've worked with the other speakers actually extensively over the years. So if I can just get going, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what the big picture is, both in terms of the geographic big picture, the nature of wildfire in our region, and with as much compassion as I can muster, talk about a little bit about what happened and how we can take something positive away from it as professionals, as architects, planners, garden designers, citizens, and neighbors. So with that, let's see if I can get moving here. You probably already know this. Again, this is the context for this talk. We keep seeing headlines like this everywhere. And sorry, it's not letting me advance here. How can I do this? What's going on here? Oh, I think I know why that is. I apologize. There we go. Did I do that? I think I did that. Okay. So here's where we are. I work for the Resource Conservation District of the Santa Monica Mountains. I'm also an architect in private planning and practice in architecture and planning, and moved to Topanga 33 years ago and was welcomed first by the Northridge earthquake and then by the Old Canyon fire. So welcome to Southern California. You all live here. You know what it's like. There's this thing we talk about called the wildland-urban interface. I want to start talking about that so we can change the way we talk about it, because I think it's a misleading term. I was asked a year or so ago by Wade Graham, who's a landscape ecologist, writing a book on that he calls the Los Angeles County Almanac, to talk a little bit about Los Angeles, and somehow he asked me to name the seasons. And at the time, this is what I thought of the seasons of Los Angeles, living in the wildland urban interface intermix. I don't feel as fearful as I used to, but what just happened was a cause to reassess for sure. I've been working in wildfire related design intensively for the last 15 years, and this one threw me for a loop. So zooming out, this is kind of, you know, us architects, our sketchbooks are our journals. The true story of wildland urban fire. Let's talk about that. It's really not an interface. It starts in the mountains, it goes to the sea, and everything in it is where we live. It's where our companion species live. And when the wind is on fire, it's all one thing. It goes from mountains to coast. Right. So what I'm going to do to talk about a little specifics of this is is look at the northern portions of the Palisades fire. In most of my slides, don't think about orientation. Think of wind comes from the left. Wind is blowing hard in these slides from left to right. So what I'm looking at here is the eastern boundary, therefore, of the Palisades fire, showing our Noli plan here, which is you've got the fire footprint in red and the Palisades as it was on the right with the, again, the red tracing around here. This is what we lost, those red overlays. So you can start to see the footprint here of the Palisades. Much different. This is similar for Altadena, of course. There's a little noise in this, but that's appropriate. That's basically debris. If you look there now, and this is what we're starting from. This is the community. I'm a part of this community, although I don't live there. So how did this happen? And what do we do next? This shows that fire shed, the same area. There are two little red marks for reference. One is the ignition point. We'll talk a little bit about ignition, but you can kind of see relative to what happened next. Doing a whole lot more than 100 feet from your house, it's not futile, but we need to focus close. And this is the good news as architects and landscape designers. We have the ability to really help out here in the rebuild process. That little reference there is a reservoir, covered reservoir area in the Upper Palisades. What you're seeing here is known as the alphabet streets in the Palisades, and we're gonna zoom in here. Green circles are what remains, and there's some other little notes here. Green circles and red are elements that remain here from the fire, and they're very instructive to talk about what in overview what you're going to get a lot more detail on here from the other speakers. So zooming in, the first thing that I noticed, and again, I've got to apologize here that I haven't been able to get on site. This is not meant to be authoritative. These are speculations and findings, but they confirm a lot of the principles that we've talked about for years, and that you'll hear more about today. So one of the things we noticed, here's before and after. For the most part, those green outlines there, those particular homes represent homes that are less than 10 years old, in some cases 2 years old, including one I didn't highlight in green, which is a bit older, actually. But the first thing you notice is that everything that survived was newer, with the sole exception of this gentleman. It is a gentleman in yellow. I don't know how that remains. That's one of those mysteries. As Pat Derlin, who trains us in wildland fire, and you could all get trained as well in home ignition zone evaluation, would say, all you can say is that home did not meet the requirements for combustion, which are heat, oxygen. Oxygen is enhanced by wind. And finally, ignition, right? Ignition is the other, fuel. So that house is next to two houses that were built one was built in 2022 and they're gone. So there are exceptions here, but that's one of the takeaways here. What we're going to see here is that this fire, once it got beyond the wildland, which was very, very fast this time. I mean, we're really fortunate that people got out. Once it got into the urban condition, it was house to house, some combination of radiant heat and flames bending over, right? There's way more fuel in a house than any component of the landscape. Not that landscape's not important, you'll be hearing about that, but once a home is on fire, that's your threat. So initial thought was, okay, well, let's look at how we can separate and reduce radiant heat. Initially thought, right, here's a garden wall infrastructure. Maybe we need to rethink our towns as kind of walled gardens, masonry construction, etc. But here's another thing that's instructive that we saw here. These are homes remaining with some of the structures that burned close by masked out. And what you can see here on what is actually the east side of the street here, again, wind was coming from the left. Look at this varied setback condition. What that ended up doing, this is your zone one. Zone one you'll hear about. Zone one is the first 30 feet beyond the home. So these homes made it because for the most part, they didn't have the fuel of another home within their zone one. You'll be hearing about zone zero, first 5 feet, zone one, first 30. That's really, really instructive given the very few surviving homes in this fire. Again, this is new construction on the south, and you can see the new construction shielding older construction with the wind coming from the left. Again, here's a close-up of that situation before and after. The next one is a guest house, right? These are interesting. These are flag lots. So you have essentially a wider zone zero, which is the driveways either side. I highlighted this 6-foot wide, probably about 12-foot tall hedge, box hedge here. It was particularly green, but look at the post fire on the right. That home's completely burned. There's nothing standing, and that hedge is standing. Wind from the left. We'll talk a little bit about this later on, but moisture is key, right? So moisture in the soil is ember extinguishing, and who knows what this means, but we're gonna have to look at it. The right side of this is singed now, but it's still standing, as is the home. This gets into vegetation. Vegetation was not the culprit here. The wildlands, not the culprit. You know, hundreds of goats wouldn't have made a difference grazing the uplands. This is before, after. Most of what is standing vertically now, if you look at those shadows, is vegetation. And you've probably seen the photos, right? Green hedges, green tree canopy, piles of ash. Here's an example. The largest cluster of unburned homes in the alphabet streets at the end here, its nearest neighbor is vegetated open space. Now, in fairness, there's a big drop off here to Sunset, so the terrain might have a lot to do with it, but essentially that has a virtually unlimited horizontal zone 1 and 2, right? And the vegetation in all these scenarios is still there. The vegetation did not set the house on fire. Other houses ignited other houses. Again, some of these new construction, but look, corner houses did better, and this is true in Altadena as well. Just more setback, essentially, from radiant heat from homes. I want to acknowledge Eaton as well, and wrap it up here. But Eaton, the lessons are a little different. But I got a call from Ronnie Siegel, who Cal Poly landscape architect. I think she's retired now, teacher there. She said, I noticed this thing about trees, and Stephanie will talk about this more. Did a really quick analysis of what the interface actually is. And if you remember from these damage maps, black means they inspected it and it's fine, right? Smoke damage, but fine. So the less black you had along the actual wind interface, in this case, wind is from the upper, from the north, which is up and to the right, northeast. There were these patches where I started to black out that was mostly kind of, blank out here, mostly undamaged structures. And sure enough, this outline in white is Christmas Tree Lane, which is what Ronnie said. It seemed like less things burned. And so my green footprint here is residential area because commercial is a little different. So I didn't show that. Commercial also fared pretty well in Altadena. Um, but this is unburned residential area with what should be a wildland wick, right? Coming right down in the city. This is really important because we're also doing connectivity work and about to start a big connectivity master plan. We really want people to understand that vegetation, tree canopy, microclimate enhancing things like that, and life affirming things like that are not the culprits in wildfire in our regime. If the wind is on fire, we have a problem. Here it is again, wind from the left, did not transmit fire into the core of the city. It's a slice through the damage zone. So again, last thing I want to say is this is also something to look at. I live in Topanga. Topanga is now doing red flag resident only closures. It's a few days a year. Some years it's not at all. That's done because of the concern about evacuation safety. But it also has a 20-year arson watch group, and that fire did not start north of us. And cause unknown, I predict you will be seeing cause unknown for all of these fires for months to come because that's code for something else. And I don't want to leave it negative, but that's also something we got to think about as citizens is how do we manage access to our open space? Last thing, you'll be seeing this with Elisa a bit, but you know, the opportunity here is to build back in a resource conserving way, and probably resource conserving smaller equals better setbacks. And my takeaway here to leave you with this is more garden, less house. If your clients are going to take you wall to wall, setback to setback, you may have to look at fire rated assemblies as architects that are not required by code or above and beyond. That seems to be the early takeaway here. So keep that in mind. But hey, if everyone's dream is the smaller house and the big garden, now's a good time to think about that. So I'll be sticking around for questions and I'll hand it off to Elisa now.
Actually, it's Melanie, I believe. So.
Oh, you're right.
Sorry, Melanie. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Clark. That was super helpful. All those maps were really informative. I'm going to zoom us out, I think, a little bit. We'll zoom us out and then zoom us back in. So I'm just going to talk about a little bit about the Zone Zero initiative that's been going on. So I'll share my screen actually so we can actually see what I'm talking about. So I'm just going to really quickly talk about Zone Zero, what it is, how it came about, and what are some strategies that we can implement. Because like Clark said, the landscape isn't the issue, and what Zone Zero is really taking into account is how we can eliminate vegetation in these areas where I think that maybe there's some other solutions here that we can do. So looking at defensible space as a whole, in California, it varies, but typically it's about 100 feet from the building, which I want to say that when we're living in, and Stephanie, I know that it drives you crazy too, when we see these kinds of diagrams that the houses seemingly in the middle of nowhere, but a lot of these communities, 100 foot from the house is in your neighbor's living room. So we really have to start thinking about this 100 feet, not as an individualistic, but as a holistic and as a community. That 100 feet should really bubble around all of the homes. But in California right now, 100 feet from the structure is the defensible space. It's the area surrounding a structure where plants are maintained to decrease the fire hazard and provide an opportunity for firefighters to safely defend your home.
And it's also an area that's trying to avoid fuel ladders. So fuel ladders are basically vertical space between plants that cause ignition. So where is zone zero? Zone zero is the first 5 feet of the house. And this is not a new idea, but it is something that has been more pushed for in the most recent years. So zone zero, is basically the horizontal area within the first 5 feet around the structure and any outbuildings like decks and stairs. And then the zone also includes everything underneath any decks and stair landings. And this, Elisa will talk more about the other 100 feet, but I'm going to focus really on the first 5 feet. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of how Zone Zero came about, because in previous fuel modification plans, if you've worked on any fuel modification or worked with CAL FIRE in the past, the first 30 feet was really where they were really focusing on maintenance of plants and keeping them away from each other in groupings. But in 2016, 2017, 2018, when all the fires happened in Paradise, Santa Rosa, and Redding, the California legislature pushed for AB 3074, which basically directed the Board of Forestry and Fire Protection to establish a third zone called Zone Zero as part of an ember-resistant zone. Some of the contributors of Zone Zero, a lot of notable groups that have contributed to the research, like the IBHS. They operate a full-scale research center all the way in South Carolina where they simulate wildfire conditions. And their research, which they're continuously updating, has found that homes with clean, non-combustible Zone Zero areas have dramatically higher survival rates. And they've also designated that embers are the primary source of ignition. However, going through their report, which is lengthy, I found that a lot of the research also supports that properties with well-watered plants, high moisture content, also lead to higher survival rates. So there's also the National Fire Protection Association, who created the FireWise USA program. Zone Zero is now a formal focus of their recommendations under the newer wildfire risk reduction frameworks. CAL FIRE, who spearheaded the official designation of Zone Zero. They also contributed to AB 3074, which codified Zone Zero defensible space as required fire prevention zone. They also implement inspections, public education, and fuel reduction programs in California's WUI areas. And then the UC Division of Agriculture and Natural Resources, which conducts research on fire-adapted landscaping. And they also publish science-based guidelines for Zone Zero plantings and materials. They also partner with CAL FIRE and Fire Safe Councils to deliver homeowner workshops. And then on the policy and implementation side, the California Board of Forestry and Fire Protection developed the new defensible space regulations, and they also include guidelines for Zone Zero based on legislative mandates like Gavin Newsom's executive order. They also coordinate with local fire authorities to integrate Zone Zero into local defensible space codes. Local fire safe councils are grassroots organizations that focus on education and grants, and then the NIST that support the Zone Zero principles through their WUI Fire Research Program. So all of these groups and organizations have found that the Zone Zero 5-foot buffer is really focusing on direct flame contact. So there's 3 types of fire exposures. Zone Zero reduces the likelihood of structure ignition by reducing the potential for direct ignition. It also helps with embers and radiant heat, but with embers and radiant heat, more strategies are needed in conjunction with Zone Zero to really make it work. So home hardening is one of those that with defensible space can help mitigate ember exposures. And then home hardening and fuel reduction reduces the radiant heat, which I think Clark was talking about a little bit beforehand. So here's a little bit of the ordinance language. The scariest part here is that no landscape materials that are likely to be ignited by embers are permitted within Zone 0. This includes grass, ornamentals, native plants, shrubs, branches, fallen leaves, tree needles, weeds, combustible mulches. You know, it really is, the wording of this is really vilifying plants in a way that is making it seem like we need to get rid of all of our plants around the house to make something fire safe, which is not true. So we're actively being advocates for the planting currently to get this wording sort of change. You know, woody plants, I understand there's a lot of research and I'll go through it a little bit later, but we have to understand what the climate impacts are on our neighborhoods if we start implementing these without really thinking about how we're going to move into a more sustainable future. So let's say that this house rebuilds and has their 5-foot buffer and they remove their trees, becomes a little hotter, right? But then if everyone does that, now we have a significant urban heat island increase. So, you know, one house is one thing, but we need to start planning our communities to make it make sense, right? So Stephanie had a really great quote yesterday at the SciArc that really stuck with me, saying living in communities is the landscape that makes it livable, which is so true. You know, which community would you want to live in? Do you want to live in a community of rocks and it's always hot, there's no trees? Or do you want something that's a little bit more, works with nature? You're seeing lots of plants, lots of green, lots of moisture, it's cooler. So how can we implement some strategies in Zone 0 to offset these, frankly, concerning regulations? So I'm using a lot of images from Elisa's work at Papaterra. I think that she's doing a lot of great work implementing some fire resilient landscapes that are also really, really beautiful. So water features can be cooling, they're functional, they're beautiful. And there's nothing saying that we can't have them in the Zone 0. So there's also, we can use native and drought tolerance sparingly. Native and drought tolerant plants, I won't get into it too much, but there's different types of leaf structures and sizes. A lot of the small leaf, high water retention plants actually, you know, repel flames or cool embers before they get to the structure. Well-hydrated native vegetation can actually, catch and cool embers before they get to the house rather than fueling the fire. Also replacing the wood mulch with gravel or decomposed granite to lock in that moisture in the soil around the home. And then there's also the option of lawn and walkable ground covers intermixed with hardscape even. It can be a good addition, provided it's maintained and trimmed to be pretty short. I think some communities ask for an inch, no more than an inch, but it varies per community. So there's a lot of different options that we can do here. That's not just remove all your plants. These are some general recommendations that I have seen from my research with the Wildfire Task Force at ASLA. So no combustible mulch, no bark chips, non-combustible ground covers, which we talked about, like gravel, stone, or hardscaping, but keeping the area free of leaves, pine needles, and debris. This is the biggest one, I think, is maintenance. Your landscape is only as good as its maintenance. You have to make sure that if you're living in these fire-prone areas, it is your responsibility to make sure that your landscape and your home are hardened against really an ecology of fire. We live in fireland. It works for our native species, so we have to make it work for us as well. Also other materials besides planting, like wooden fences and gates that touch the home, they're requesting that they are non-combustible materials or not touching the home at all. Using low fire-resistant ground covers, which we talked about. And then another big one is just keeping the plants well irrigated and maintained. Making sure that you have a good irrigation system, your planting is well irrigated, is going to do a lot more for the home than clearing it all out. And then lastly, just some more general recommendations. This is actually some notes from Douglas Kent, who's a specialist in ecological management. He's also an educator at UCLA and the author of Firescaping, Protecting Your Home with Fire-Resistant Landscape. He's been kind enough to inform us over at ASLA, our Climate Action Committee, and our Wildfire Task Force. So here's some thoughts from him. You know, plants are not the enemy. We need to advocate for plants and for a more sustainable future. I like this one. Reasons to defend vegetation within 5 feet. They bring joy. We love having the birds, the bees, the pollinators, and we want to provide habitat for all of our native species while also cooling a warming world and improving public health. So I think there's definitely strategies for Zone Zero that we can further research, but it also extends out into the broader wildland urban matrix, as Clark says. So I will pass it over to Elisa, who's going to talk more about that.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so I will be sharing my presentation. Everybody see this?
Yeah.
Our agenda is great. We're going to discuss Zone 1. And just so that we're clear, Zone 0 is, as Melanie mentioned, from the face of the building, face of decks, anything that's attached to the building that is a flammable part of the structure, out 5 feet. Not the eaves, but the face of this element touching the ground. About 5 feet, that's your ember resistance zone. So you're avoiding materials that will burn within that zone. Bushes and plants are not recommended, especially underneath windows and places where the fire could break into the structure. So we're going to focus on Zone 1. In our Zone 1, we're going to review a case study of the city of Altadena. Or the fire in Eaton Fire in Altadena. I am here. I was evacuated. I live in Pasadena technically, but it was part of not only very personal to me in many ways. And then we're going to look at design principles for plant selections and a few resources that we want to share with you guys that you have it to go with. This is from the website defensiblespace.org that Clark Stevens, Greg Kochanowski, RCD, Rios, and I spearheaded back in 2020 as a result from the Woolsey fire. The Need to Educate is a CAL FIRE sponsored project, and it's a really good educational tool for homeowners and designers. And so the Zone 1, we call it the home protection zone, and it's designed to slow the spread of fire from the wildlands coming into the property. And the way that you do that is that you keep the landscape lean, clean, and green. We are looking at 30 feet in flatlands and 50 feet in 20% or more slope. So that Zone 1 is a little fudgy, depends on the slope of the site. You go up to 50 feet. And what you do planting wise is that you are planting less densely and less tall closer to the home. So we're creating islands of plantings which are less dense, but also more irrigated. And then you taper it out to a bit more dense, imitating natural wildlands and decreasing the water as it goes out, but still maintaining that whole zone irrigated as much as possible, because as Clark mentioned, it is dry ground that causes the fires. When we recently had very high winds, like a week ago, 2 weeks ago, it was 40-something miles to 50-mile gust winds. We had just come out from a rain, and as you could tell, there was no issues. So the ground was saturated at that point. So we want to protect our soil, and we want to protect the moisture levels. Next, we want in the wild urban interface, especially, which we now know is a dire city. California is a biodiversity hotspot. There's only 35 of those in the world, and we are one of the most richest and most highly populated and decimated biodiversity hotspots. So we want to promote the use of native plant material You could use non-native species, but you have to be really mindful about their invasive qualities. And you should also look at plants' characteristics that makes them more flammable. So there'll be more about that. And of course, as I mentioned, irrigate the plants because we want to keep that soil moisture, lots of mulch. And so here's a representation of fire behavior in the chaparral. Most images and most information out there talks about wildfire in forests that have a canopy, like a pine forest or an oak woodland. They have a taller canopy and a bigger separation between ground and floor plane, and usually there's grasslands below that. In the case of the chaparral, you practically eliminate the kind of the ground plane separation, and the entire canopy is on the ground. And so fire travels uphill quicker, devoid of wind. And so protecting your home from both the east side wind direction and uphills are one of the biggest characteristics or issues or ways that you will have to mitigate and start thinking about how do you protect the home. We'll talk about a little bit more later, but like Clark mentioned and Melanie, the presence of large canopy trees, very well irrigated plant material will stop the windbreak, could engulf fire, and protect the home from reaching the property. Some of the hardscape measures that we could do are to create all these fire breaks within the property is to include pavement, dry creek bed. It's always a good idea to preserve the moisture in the site and seep the water into the ground. Retaining walls, maintaining your trees and your vegetation. That is key. It's all about maintenance, year-round maintenance. Separating canopy from the ground. Soil berms, we call them hula culture sometimes. Those kind of things improve the soil quality and the moisture in the ground and slow the spread of fire. Our case study is Altadena. And so here is a map from defensiblespace.org under the location tab where we could see the fire history in the area. As we mentioned, and we all keep hearing that we are in an ecology of fire. But the problem has become that we are burning way too soon, too repeated after the previous fire, so our environment is not able to keep up. And then this is what happens. It's called type conversion, where normally a fire in the chaparral was a 30 to 100-year occurrence. Now it's happening every 5 years, every 10 years, which then creates impossible for that native habitat to rebound. Invasive species take hold, and usually the invasive species that we have here in Southern California, the oriental grass, the mustards, become really high flame and high fuel. So the fuel load of invasive species is usually less hot than the native species because they are slower and more woody plants, but also a lot faster. And so when we start embedding all this fast fuel into native land, then we create a wick of fire coming into the slower burning native California chaparral. We have probably all heard recently that the CAL FIRE high severity fire zones have been updated and expanded. And then in the case of Altadena, we are looking at that urban grid, which before wasn't something we have considered as much. There's very few examples of fire protruding into the urban grid like it did in the recent years. And so what does that 5-mile radius look like as we reinvent what would be the new rebuild? And so these are the existing home, model of the existing home, the next layer of the zone 0 feet to 5 feet from the house, which we tend to like to organize our hardscape paving, our walkways, around the house, instead of having a gap of plants and then a walkway, now you're walking against the building, which also helps with moisture intrusion on the building and keeping the building protected. And then this is zone 1, 30 feet from the property. And as you can tell, it's all starting to merge into each other. And then we get these amazing pockets of vegetation that could be returning back to the wildland within the urban space, like Clark mentioned, in order to promote a better habitat in fire resistance overall. This is an example of a cluster of 6 homes within this area, and how everybody's zone, the 30-foot offset, is on top of each other. And so what we need to do is think about in maybe block size, like this is how you protect a community in individual blocks, and mindful of your neighbors. And so then our next topic is about planting. And so this is a very long topic, and we can go very deep into the planting part, but we're just going to give you some high-level principles and tools. We are looking for plants that have these characteristics, which are stiff, leathery leaves, stiff, like oak woodlands, the oaks, stiff leaves, waxy leaves. Those plants tend to hold moisture very well. They don't let it escape as easy. They have a bigger support for solar incidence on them. Silver or hairy leaves, the same. This is kind of like a sunblock on a plant. Sometimes you see it chalky. There's tiny leaves also. The smaller the leaves, the less amount of sun on each leaflet. And so moisture loss is reduced. And then solar tracking. You'll see certain plants that change their way their foliage is angled between morning and middle of the day in order to protect themselves from the amount of sun that's being that's incident on them. And so there's other plants that we can use. You don't have to use all native, but we do recommend it, only because we have been encroaching on our native habitat and reducing this incredible rich native habitat. The world wants to use our plants, but in urban areas, and there's many reasons why you will want to use a mix of plants. Just be mindful of their invasive species qualities. So don't introduce something that's invasive, and protect what you already have. There's a heritage into the plants that you have in your garden, so it doesn't mean that you have to wipe the surface all over again. And provide source of food year round. That's important both for people and habitat. And so what we learned in the Woolsey fire and seen also here on these recent fires is that oak woodlands tend to protect structures. Flying embers that come into an oak are suffocated, and there was many properties that have been saved by the presence of oak. So encouraging our oak woodland, not only for the habitat value of it, but also for the fire protection. And so here are our resources. The Sustainable Defensible Space website we mentioned. Every tab here, house, landscape, plants, location, community. There's so much resources there for people to dive in. RCD was the leading entity on that website, and they provide services for homeowners, free to homeowners on home evaluation for hardening and for the defensible space, which are CAL FIRE and other grants. There's also really amazing resources by the City of LA and the Water Department. This plant pretty much has the information from the Los Angeles Water Department pretty much has the whole lid measures in a very digestible way for homeowners to apply into their home. The CalScape website Garden Planner is fabulous. It gives you an amazing list of plants and ideas for your garden. That is like a very powerful tool. The Sugi project that started in Japan, which is like densifying urban pockets, and it is something that we should be considering and adopting. We looked at the CAL FIRE map experience. And then lastly, I want to note that we are in Native people land. The Native knowledge has been disconnected from our lands for very long. Fire was part of the ecology, but in our coastal sage scrub. The majority of the work was done by the tending of the land, whether it was by people or by ruminating herds, which are now practically all gone. The Altadena area, the Tonga people have their own land, which is the very first time in history that they physically own land since colonial times. It suffered from the Ito Canyon. It's right at the edge of the Ito Canyon. So we want to encourage that you support and just let's really have a conversation to return methods of horticulture that will provide us with a better future. And that is our talk. And so now I pass it on to Stephanie.
Hello, everybody. Are you seeing my screen?
Yes.
All right, excellent. So thank you very much. I'm Stephanie Landrigan. I'm the director of the UCLA Extension Landscape Architecture and Horticulture programs. And I also am an activist for the trees. So we've had a lot of background from Clark, really rich studies of what some of the trees have done. We've talked about Zone 0 with Melanie, and then more in detail into some of the planting from Elisa and those studies. What I'm going to talk to you about is something that's happening boots on the ground right now in Altadena, California, from the Eaton fire. Because I'm seeing if this thing is going to... What we saw, I live next door to Altadena. And as the fire was advancing, I had fire and ash coming over the hill. I evacuated. It was an unreal experience because it wasn't, as everybody said, a wildfire. It was a conflagration. It was a fire of buildings, igniting buildings. And in this picture, which I find interesting, as you will see, and I don't know what happened there, but let's try it again. Okay. It burned so much, but when you look at the immediate Yahoo photos afterwards, you see a lot of remaining vegetation. And that's the fascinating thing about it. In this picture, I was fortunate enough after, the conflagration actually wasn't put out until later in January, but there were areas where you could still access it. It's unlike the Palisades. You can't just cut it off on the PCH because there are so many ways to access Altadena. So as going up there and visiting with my friend Wynn Wilson, whose house was lost and her lovely garden, I'm driving up slowly. What do I see is trees. Do you all hear something in the background?
Yes. Could you please turn your audio
please
on?
mute.
Okay. So thank you. This is what I saw. This is January 16th. You see these fabulous, there were pines, Italian stone pines, which come from the Mediterranean region, which is a biome, and it is a fire regime also. So as we're looking at what we see here, the thing I noticed as I'm driving through here, and I'm noticing the devastation, but I'm also just amazed by the fact that there were these surviving trees in the midst of terrible destruction. And this is an oak that's actually off Fair Oaks. And the amazing thing about this oak is that eventually it was marked to be taken out, but we were able to have this tree saved. And as Clark was saying, the actual winds came from the north east, and you'll see the front of this tree is facing the northeast. The backside of the tree is singed. The front is alive. This tree was not igniting the house behind it. The house was igniting the tree. This is a phenomenon that we saw over and over. Here are some deodars. They're pretty amazing. And look in the background here. Did these deodars save these houses? Do we know that? Here we have a beautiful remnant. And many of these trees, what you're going to see on them when you're there is they have burns. And many of those burns are on the side that was facing a structure. So if we're looking at zone 0 and zone 1 and zone 3, and we're looking at some of these lots here actually may fit the 200 by 200 foot square area that we see in these defensible spaces. But the reality is in Altadena, many of these spaces are 50 by 150 foot lots. So the reality of what you see in these defensible spaces cannot even be scaled if you look at it. So how are we going to come up with an urban defense that incorporates much of the learning from what is going into the zone 0 regulations and to apply it within a very urban pattern? And we're going to talk about patterns here. Here's another oak that survived. Oaks are just magnificent. And when I was driving through here, one of the things that was so hopeful to me is there was bird song. This was, of course, before I had seen all these giant excavators and all of these people. I heard a little bit of noise from Edison cutting down trees, putting up lines, and re-electrifying Altadena. And that was another issue. So what I'd like to talk about is when you're trying to save trees, and I'm going in the wrong, you discover you're out there and all of a sudden you're like, what are these signs? We're seeing these signs on all of these trees. We're seeing actual markings on the trees that are X, equal signs, up, equal signs, actually. And then we had red tags. And you'll see down at the bottom here a little barcode. And these were originally tagged by EPA so that the people who were coming in to do the toxic cleanup were safe. They knew about the hazards. So this tree might fall on you. There might be a branch up there that is an imminent hazard, and others is medium hazard, where you couldn't really assess a big hazard. And then others are just, they're going to take it out. Then we noticed next, the Army Corps of Engineers mobilized, and we saw what we called the blue dots of death. And we started seeing trees having the blue dots of death. And we were very concerned. We have with us, and we is Altadena Green, a group of 6 passionate activists and tree lovers and landscape architects and designers and arborists gathered together. And we started just being a pain in the butt for the EPA and also the Army Corps. We're like, what's going on here? Have you looked at these trees? We had no idea who had been hired to be taking care of the trees. It is a national bid that goes out. And a national bid was bringing arborists from all over the United States who had no idea about our native species or any trees that would grow actually in California. We saw trees that were mismarked, and we started, especially they had the 3 dots of death on oak trees that were going to come back. They were labeled Chinese elms. And so we were very, very concerned. So we had volunteers. We went out with 20 volunteer arborists who we had called up, and they went out and they were reassessing the trees the Army Corps had already assessed. And we took a list of 20 properties to the Army Corps and we said, these are mismarked. These trees are viable. We've had arborists who are trained in fire assessment, and these neighbors are not wanting you to take out their trees. So they said, well, they're a hazard and they're liability will have to be assumed. Somebody else is drawing on my screen now. Okay, thank you. So what we did, and I'm very proud of us, and James, I can't get rid of your markings, but if you would, that would be wonderful. We advocated with the Army Corps of Engineers. I actually took them some banana nut bread, sat down at their little mobile area, and I said with my other colleagues, we can't have these trees being taken out. Altadena is known for its canopy. And what was interesting is we already knew that the county was going to take care of the street services. So we were working to protect the private canopy, which was so contributive to the sense of place. I mean, it was an emotional attachment, but it was also the reality of that these trees too were survivors, and they needed the chance to recover. So we actually worked with the Army Corps and got them to issue a tree waiver. Now, there are instances in Hawaii where this had never happened, and I do have to call out both Colonel Swenson and Colonel Ashavar, who were reasonable human beings, and we were able to talk to them, and they issued a new fire assessment, which is this. This came out after we were able to talk to them. And what's interesting is they reassessed these trees that we had marked, and they were taking off the blue dots of death. They would put brown stuff in, they took off the tag, and they put yellow tags, tie a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree. And we were happy to see these yellow ribbons appear. Now, the reason this is important is if Edison comes on your property or LADWP to trim a tree to put up a pole, they have to talk to the property owner. And the Army Corps of Engineers, contractors, had a right of entry, and that right of entry gave them the right to remove anything within the burn scar. And that included even a viable tree. So we wanted it to be the homeowners, the residents' choice. And so this was a very important advancement. Now, we all know, I don't have to tell you the economic, environmental benefits of trees, but when we were up there last, this is a little fescue who's coming back, my little friendly fescue after all the rains. Now, what is important about this and Zone 0 is these trees, these oak trees, these deodars, these stone pines, even the Canary Island pines, the Canary Island palms have survived. They all come from a regime of fire. Now, and as Elisa was saying, we really need to look at, if we do take it from the Mediterranean biome, which runs across Chile and Australia and the Mediterranean and California, we need to look at other fire regimes if we're going to be importing trees that we want to put here. But the trees have to be considered in the Zone 1, especially as being contributive vegetative buffers. And if there were more than one tree in the space behind me, if there were 2 or 3, would that house have been saved? I think that's a question we have to keep asking. And I wanted you to know that if it's a time that you don't know what's going on and you can't seem to figure it out, it never hurts to activate yourself. We considered ourselves first responders. We stepped up to the fact that we saw things on trees that we thought were wrong, and we bulldogged it all the way to the Army Corps. And I think by doing that, and we're trying to become a 501c3, Altadena Green is. We have not yet become a 501c3. So we did this out of pocket, out of time, on the weekends, early in the morning before we went to work, to try to save these trees. And the reality is we're not going to be able to save all these trees. And some of the trees aren't going to survive. But the trees that we save are going to be really valuable in the future in the rebuilding that occurs here. And trees are going to be valuable in the rebuilding. And we need to talk with the changes that are occurring in the regulations, in the zones, the fire zones, and present evidence that green buffers can be trees. They're not just a hedge. They're not from the ground up. Canopies have such a value in so many instances, especially in the Palisades. The very few remnants that are there. But when you come over here to Altadena and you see the very fast ember-driven fire, and John, Rick Halsey, John Keeley, both say they're both renowned fire specialists in the Chaparral here. All our fires are going to be ember-driven. We're not going to have a fire that's just going to be in a location. It can ignite a community 10, 20 miles away. So we need to be responsible in all that we do, in all that we build in these zones. And we might even have to look at zoning. Zoning setbacks maybe need to be called fire setbacks. We need to become more responsible in the rebuild. And we need to have, I would say, elected officials who are brave enough to say, this is an opportunity to build it right. And we need to discourage our politicians from saying, we'll build it back the same and I'll give you 10% more, because that is not encouraging us to make the paradigm shift that we need to. And we need to counter legislation that is not as smart as it should be, because we're smart enough to help create legislation that works. So I think that's the end of my presentation. If you'd like to see what Altadena Green is doing, we'd love to have you take a look. And I think we're in time for some conversations.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, all of you, for the presentations. Really fantastic. And there's a lot of great conversation going on in the chat. I think Clark and Melanie and others have been jumping in and answering some of your questions here. Please raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll call on you in order just to sort of make it manageable. There was a question back here. So Alejandra, did I just see you raise your hand? You popped in and popped off.
Yeah, I don't see any raised hands just now.
Okay. Someone just quickly had a comment about eucalyptus, and I'm trying to get to the actual question here to make
I
sure.
guess it was more about like the appropriate species and native species. Yeah.
We're getting hands now.
Oh, okay.
Here we go.
All right, all hands on deck. Great.
Cheryl, why don't you jump in?
Hi, thank you. My name is Cheryl Drinkwater. I'm in Northern California, but I do enjoy all these, anything has to do with wildfire and protecting our homes and properties. I have heard a couple of times, mostly from LA speakers, about this protective quality of oak trees and other native trees were implied here, and them being ember protector, protecting the home from embers. Is there any research on this? Because I have not been able to find any. And since I am also an educator, I try to, encourage science-backed best management practices. And I'm just looking for research. Has there been any research?
Can I answer that? There's a lot of research going on right now, and some of it is actually occurring with Matt Ritter, who is up in the Cal State Davis, up at Davis. We also have Edith de Guzman down here is doing research on this, as well as Alessandro Osceolo and Francisco J. Escobedo. These are people who, but it's fresh, Cheryl. This is fresh. We're just doing the research right now.
There's some, Stephanie, and someone actually shared one I hadn't seen in the chat. So I think there's early on, and maybe we can get that highlighted somehow. But yeah, and I also added in the chat that We have completed a high resolution ember modeling study. Most of the funding went to creating the model, so that trees are more than what they started calling box of rocks, right? That's what the modelers call a porous, surface that the wind encounters. It's fluid dynamics, so we're able to build on things that have to do with, it's like hydraulics, right? But we'll be putting, I said I've got Bella's here too, working on an executive summary of that will show, at least initially, the behavior of what they call vegetated fences and how that impacts a very highly detailed and modeled ember flow field, like particle size, layering, everything is like. So we're hoping to get more funds to start looking at specific conditions, but it's like what you think. Anyone who's from snow country knows about snow drifts. And a similar kind of principle. And so tree canopy can actually lift laminar flow up and beyond your home, talking to what Stephanie was saying about the north, oaks on the north side of the home. Well, the biggest drop off is the turbulence created after the wind passes over a vertical object. So a continuous canopy just lifts that. And Rick Halsey actually has images from Northern California where you have single stand. Things are pretty different up in Northern California in terms of the structure of the vegetation, but it's shown that in some of these photos, you see the damage was less, or at least came later, immediately adjacent the wind, adjacent the trees, right? And it was worse down because of the drop off and things depositing. So anyway, there's good stuff there. We're trying to turn it into design parameters for all of us to work with, but it's a process. But you already have LA County on board that they'd like to replace every bit of fine flashy fuels, which are typically invasive grasses, typically in that overdone 300 feet around subdivisions that we have, with oak woodlands. They're already on board.
Well,
anyway, at least on north and east slopes.
That was a great answer. Thank you, everybody.
Kate, I think you were next.
Hi, thank you. Yes, I just wanted to, I see that Stephanie, you've answered a little bit of question about the native California sycamores in the chat, but talking about how they were dormant, so they didn't ignite. But I'm wondering what about when they're not dormant?
Well, I don't have any evidence on that because my research right now has just been on these trees here. The guess is that if they have very large leaves. They love to retain water. They're a riparian species. So I would assume that they too would be actually extremely resilient, but it appears, and I'm going to just make this as an educated assumption here, is that the evergreen trees actually are probably the better choice for a lot of this vegetative buffer. And only because even then we have a canopy that is capturing the embers and dispersing them ahead of time.
Thank you.
I also want to add that we have become drier and drier and drier. And so the plant material that used to be here, that is native of this area, isn't migrating as fast as we're drying up the area, right? And so we need to consider the sycamores as something that might not really fit anymore in our environment. For very special occasions, sycamores take a lot of water. In all the way north in the Sierras, sycamores dry up creeks because there isn't enough water, right? Even though so we should be very mindful of what kind of plants we're putting here, not only natives, but also of drier climates, drier desert climates too.
100%, Elisa. We've seen a shift in some of the native planting. We're starting to get more native Mexican plants in response to our current conditions, and plants that we may have used in the past are no longer applicable.
Mhm.
I
I
was
think
just going
I'll,
to add,
oh,
if,
sorry, Clark, go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
yeah, if you have sycamores in your environment, it probably means that you're in a riparian zone if they're growing naturally. And so that certainly is a benefit from defensible space. But I agree to Lisa's approach. We also want to be careful about water management. So soil moisture doesn't equal a lot of irrigation. It doesn't have to, right? In fact, complex built soils, right? If you think about designing and building your soils, particularly that next 5 to 10 to 15 feet, almost as far as you want, honestly, that rich soil will take the same amount of water and just hold it longer, literally encapsulate it, release it. And that is the measure now for ignition probability that's most used, even though you hear about fuel moisture, and that's how they should try and guess how bad the season's going to be, the fire season. It's really what is most closely correlated is the ground condition relative to dryness with ignition. So gardening in the old traditional sense, right, and even food gardening, good in that zone 1. You have to be careful with natives, right? They like crappy soil, so a lot of them. So that happens beyond, but we don't need a lot of deep soil. But I do think it's a great opportunity. It's maybe the best opportunity for a landscape surface in urban small lot conditions is to have as much permeable, good soil as possible.
Ollie, I think now you're up.
Hi, my question is directed towards Stephanie, but I would like anybody's anybody to contribute. I had a corner property in Altadena that was surrounded, the perimeter was surrounded by trees. There are 8 native oaks, 6 are native. I think 2 are not native. One of them is like you said about that biosphere of the Mediterranean. It's actually a cork oak from either Spain or Portugal, and it fared very well. My native oaks, though, got the brunt of the embers, and I'm freaking out. I saved the trees. I wrapped them in caution tape. I wrote signs. I put this on the U.S. Army Corps site map. They were respectful of my wishes. However, I did hire an arborist who came by, and he said that you're going to have to, a male and a female arborist, and they both said you have to, there are 2 trees with severe damage. Half of it's alive and will probably live, but I have to cut the other half. So I started cutting. I had cut these areas where there was nothing was blooming, nothing was blossoming. It was just charred. But now, I mean, the oaks have been very stressed, and now I'm freaking out because they're the focal point of my property and I love them. And I have to get water on them as soon as possible. We have no water where I am. There's no water service. I've called companies, I've called other water companies asking if they have a mobile watering service, like a conditioning truck that's used in construction. And you've seen them around when they're doing debris removal. There are conditioning trucks, and I cannot hire one. And I asked other neighbors, and they said they would be willing to collectively bargain to have their trees also watered. My trees are so stressed. And the arborists are saying, you've got a 50-50 chance right now, and it's up to you to get water on this property. And I don't know what to do.
Well, I'll give you a quick answer, Ollie. And have you gone to our contact information at Altadena Green?
I wrote you.
Okay, so it would be good right now to mulch there, because that'll hold any moisture that you're going to put on it. One woman is, and you all have 5 different water companies up there, which is really a major issue. Some of the folks have water, others don't. Maybe the areas where they have water, you can talk to your neighbors. she is bringing 5-gallon buckets of water and just pouring them on her plant. We are looking for a grant to see if we can get a water truck up there to assist with this. There are some CAL FIRE grants. So stay in touch with Altadena Green and we're going to keep you up. But it is something, it is true. And if you water, you want to put mulch on it now. Typically you would want oak tree leaves to be the mulch, but a looser mulch will also keep the moisture you're putting in there and actually help the tree as it's trying to recover. And you're right. They have a 50-50 chance. And I want to thank you so much for giving them that chance. You're an amazing lady. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'm sorry for your loss. So sorry for your loss.
Justin, I think you're up next.
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, okay. Stephanie, I really love what you guys are doing. For people that don't know, I'm a utility consultant, so I've been kind of tracking where DWP is going to be placing their poles, and when they're going to be doing that. So there is a ravine in the Palisades that it's a public alley, so all the trees are on public property. And it looks like they're going to be working on that particular street in about, the next 2 weeks. But there's like hundreds of really beautiful trees that all survived. Maybe not hundreds, but a significant amount. I put in the chat what the address is. Is there any way for, someone to go in there and talk to DWP before they actually start putting lines back up in that ravine? Because if you look at what they're doing in the alphabet streets, there's nothing taller than the poles, and all the poles are going back up. So I just think it's a great place to focus right now, however we can, or however I can. That's it.
Justin, I've been talking with LADWP, and they have been talking with their contractors as well as with their own vegetation management crew. And they are going to become, they are dealing with all the ANSI requirements that are there. They have previously been removing trees under an emergency effort. I would I'll give you Carl Mellinger's phone number. He's an arborist out there who has been activating and working with me with LADWP. And I'll send you his information. I have your phone number. I have your email address, and have Carl go out there and also he has the same contacts at LADWP that I do. But thank you for bringing that to attention, because we know there has been a lot of removal that we think could have required a lot of better thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin.
Stephanie, I think you're up.
Yeah, hi everyone. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Stephanie. It's good to see you again. And this has been a great presentation, a lot of really rich information. I'm glad that you're tracking legislation. And my question is, if the legislation is so far written badly, how can we help insurance companies get back to California, because they're fleeing California? And if insurance companies are not comfortable coming to California, then only the wealthy can afford to rebuild. So I'm just curious what we can do to help in that area.
Well, I'm not the only one who can answer this, but the insurance companies have to be at the same table as we are when we're writing legislation. Some of this it's a regulation they're putting out, so it's guidelines. It's not a legislative mandate. The actual method of enforcement is going to be fire inspectors. So there are even guidelines that, so you're into policy too. We're both kind of crazy like that. But we have the regulations, then we have the materials that are going to be used for inspections for inspectors that will then be accepted as city by city by fire departments. So it has a huge trail that happens. But right now, there are 2 hearings. There was one on Monday for the Zone 0 regulations. It was not in person. They had said there would be in person. It's up in Sacramento, but it was a virtual one. There's going to be one on May 19th, and I know that AIA and Will and everyone is very interested in looking at ways, and Clark too. Clark's definitely always has his fingers in these areas because he's got a good grip on it. And ASLA is also working on it. But we need to bring up some of their research that they're not using to inform some of the regulations. And we have right now at this time to influence some of that regulation because of the actual open sessions that they're going to have. It is supposed to be enacted by June. So if you haven't looked at it, we can, and Clark can raise some elements here.
Yeah, I just want to encourage everyone here because of trees, right? Trees are the problem, the Zone 0 plan right now, the challenge is, and this is where the north-south divide in our state comes in. I'm happy to have someone here tuning in from the north. Maybe you can convince, if you're anywhere near Sacramento, others to be as interested as you are. We're getting there. I mean, Wade Crowfoot's doing a lot. The whole idea of calling what we have a forest is right. We have forests without legs. We have shrublands. We have, right? And so the biggest problem right now is that they're talking about shade trees, which is what I call trees that encroach on your Zone 0 vertically. Yes, you could keep overhanging trees. You just have to have 10 feet of clearance. What does that do to an oak tree? Right? There is no such thing as 10 feet of clearance. Now, the encouraging thing is, you know, that the people writing this are aware of the problems and have been, and hearing from us for a couple of years. The problem is that they're also giving us cold comfort saying, well, ultimately it's going to come down to the enforcement of the local jurisdiction. So for instance, Chief Ron Durbin would say, well, we'll look at that. It might be that we go the 2-inch rule, maybe 3 feet clear, you know, and I know that if he were the inspector, which he won't be, he's a very busy guy, I wouldn't worry about what he'd say about the oak tree. The problem is that whenever you get into a regulatory response to a design parameter, you know, speaking to designers here for the most part, so I like to give us props, right? We understand that everything, it's Stephanie mentioned pattern, right? It's solving for pattern, my favorite Wendell Berry quote. Every situation, well, if you can't do this here without doing harm, let's enhance this instead. So it's a matrix. And by the way, I forgot to mention, we have a lot of home ignition zone evaluations, site specific for free. Sign up at rcdsmm.org. Because we can look at that and say, well, we planted that bougainvillea in honor of grandpa. Okay, here's what to do instead, right? Like you can work with that. The problem with regulation is you won't, unfortunately they dumb it down. But you know, no matter how smart the regulators are, there will be someone who can outdumb them. So it's a challenge. I would say advocate, just like Stephanie is for your neighborhood. Don't assume that somebody's wearing a badge that you have to do what you're talking about. In fact, they haven't worked out in the coastal zone. You can't touch an oak tree beyond a 2-inch prune without being in violation. So they may be asking you to do something that violates another code, and that has to be worked out. So we're on it, but this would be great to get involved. Urban tree canopy, all tree canopy. What matters is the edge and what's underneath. It's vertical.
If I may, this is a lot of complex information. So if there can be some kind of simple bullet points and also dates where we can advocate, because you have numbers here, numbers of architects who many of us want to help. Many of us are helping individually. Some of us want to help on the larger, state and local, Stephanie knows, scale. So, you have, 400 people here. Help us mobilize by simplifying the information and telling us what to do and where to be active.
Agreed. And also one of the things is it's health, safety, and welfare. Landscape architects and architects are actually licensed to protect those. And I think us taking that stance and showing both health, safety, and welfare, and not just dealing with safety, has a balance. And we forget that we balance those three actual, I would say, legs of the stools that make us more responsible and tested by the state to be responsible.
Thank you all for your.
I will also say defensiblespace.org is such a great tool. Start there, like just if you haven't really spent time thinking about defensible space, both in the home hardening and in the landscape, that is a really good entry point for our Southern California environment.
I agree with Stephanie, though, Elisa, and that we should be working with Will and with Melanie, who's vice president, and Scott Rice of ASLA, and doing a combined effort, maybe even a combined webinar on the zone 0, zone 1. Zone 1 is actually more concerning to me because that's where we would have trees. And if that zone 1 has us not dealing with the fact that as what's the real thing is, if we don't harden our homes, the landscape is incidental. That house is going to burn. Whether my plant sends flames to it or not, it's going to burn because it's going to be ember driven. So if we do not first deal with home hardening and being responsible for living in and living with fire as a seasonal occurrence, we are at risk for our negligence.
I would just add radiant heat now. That's the takeaway from these fires is
exactly
the first house will be embers that got invited in. After that, it's radiant, and you work with your neighbors, but you may have to assume that your neighbor's house is on fire. What do I do then? And you're right. At that point, we've seen it's not about the plants. It's really about setbacks and rated assemblies, perhaps fire shutters, because in side lots where you've got a lot of light coming in, you can't go without windows. Might be triple glazing. I mean, we see examples where triple glazing. I just looking at one the other day, heard about it one the other day. First two panes broke, the third one survived. Right, that house is standing. This is the challenge in urban conditions is the side yard, direct radiant wraparound heat, but it's like line of sight. So heat doesn't bend like sound does. Garden walls, but look at that exposure, including some wraparound. And if you got anything within 30 feet, the driest element of your landscape is your neighbor's house. And it's got exponentially more fuel load, fuel energy, ember production, nasty toxin production, right, than any kind of landscape you could create. So you got to defend against the house next door as well. And
because
that's the only way to do it is house. Yeah.
Because your next door neighbor's house could be just 10 feet away, not 30 feet away, which they're telling you to put a tree.
Yeah, I think the average was 14 in Palisades. I think the average, taking in some that are distributed on larger lots, it's like 14-foot side yard separation. It's too close. If I could advocate for one other thing real quick, get your clients on budgets right away, because smaller might give you setbacks, and this market's going to be terrible. The insurance discussion we had, but we've got huge demand coming, and so people are underinsured.
We have time for one more. Sarah?
Sure, one more question.
Okay.
Okay.
Kedra, you've had your hand up for quite a while.
Hi. My mom actually had a question.
You go ahead and ask
Go
it,
ahead,
yeah.
Mom.
It was about the cost of, you continue with the,
Okay, so
the
a question
cost
about
of
the cost
upgrades or-
of materials, given that right now we're I mean, there's tariffs going on, there's the fact that we're trying to build back economically, having lost all of our things in our home, and we're also trying to build fire safe. So, and these materials are typically more expensive. So what is being done about the affordability of this?
Well, the tariffs just went on hold for 90 days. If there's any.
Well,
So,
I
but
yeah.
Clark, go for it.
Yeah, I'm sorry I'm talking all the time. But here's something to look at. So it's not official yet, but let's try and make it official by talking about it. There is a discussion I heard from the Fire Safe Alliance, from the chief involved, the fire chief involved with the coordinated LA City, Malibu, LA County recovery group, which is good. They're all trying to work together and make things coincident. That brace yourself, that you may be allowed to do an accessory dwelling unit and mark out where your main house is. The current regulations would require that you have a house before you can do an accessory house. One option could be, and by the way, that's also carved out, you can have a tiny house, modular, right? There's these things so you could get rid of, paying rent elsewhere, particularly if you have insurance limits on that, you can get on site faster. So I would think about if there's a big delta, because there's not much anyone can do to subsidize a market that no one has seen yet. But if you build the small house first, you're back on your property. You do lots of webinars with all the other talented landscape designers here to have a really big garden, and you live smaller, resource conserving for a while, but you will be allowed at some point in the future to build the primary dwelling. But you can get a kitchen, you can get a place to sleep, and by the way, you can have a place to store on site too. And those are low cost approaches. Getting back what you had, I know it's a problem because I've argued with 3 generations of insurance brokers, and I like them. They're a family group, but I have to tell them what things really cost and what they will cost. If my house goes, every house in my neighborhood is gone, in all likelihood. And that's a market, that's like supply and demand, right? So anyway, that's just something to think about. And it's good you're asking this question now, because I saw in Woolsey it took them over a year to realize they didn't have enough money to do what they were working on for that entire year. And, we're trying to help with that, but that's another subject. In terms of knowing what your costs are likely to be, people are working on that.
Well, I think that's probably a wrap for today. Thank you so much to the panel again for, just incredible presentations, and thank you all for the great conversation. I think we'll put in the chat, there's a whole series of these coming down the line. There's one in 2 weeks focused on Altadena, and then we'll have subsequent ones more or less every other week after that. So look at AIA California's website, as well as AIA LA, and we'll be posting all of those so you can register, etc. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks, panelists. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Take care.